Hi everyone. So I am making this video in case you either missed some of the slides in your travel group or for our remote pod because I know we did not get through all of these. So in the interest of getting through some more material, you can go ahead and watch this. Scrub through the ones we've done, or if you are very confident about the topic, you can skip around. You don't have to watch the whole thing sequentially. Just watch the parts you need. But definitely pay closer attention to the later slides, remote pod, because I know we didn't do all of those together. So we're going to go through all the parts of the cell as well as cell theory.
But I figured I'd start with something a little bit more exciting. So we're actually going to start with a demo that has to do with the vacuole. So join me for a quick field trip and then the lesson slides will begin. Hi everyone. So this part of the lesson I'm recording from my kitchen and you'll see why in a moment. So minor field trip, but here I have a rubber glove and I'm going to fill it up with water. If you do want to try this on your own, do it with a parent's permission near a sink. So here we go, filling up the rubber glove with water, and it's gonna look exactly how you expect it to look. Pretty fun to play with. Hang on one second. Okay, here it is. So we can give it some high fives. We can say, hey, nice to meet you. But you can see that it is definitely a different shape than it was before. Nice to meet you. So you can see that the water is pushing out on the plastic of the glove, and that's what's causing the glove to keep its shape. That is caused by a concept called turgor pressure. So when we let the water out, that's why we're over a sink, no more turgor pressure, the glove loses its shape. Now that's similar to why the vacuole in a plant needs to be so much bigger than a vacuole in an animal cell. The turgor pressure on the inside of the cell wall for a plant cell is what keeps the plant happy, healthy, and having its plant shape. Because remember, plants don't have internal structure, bones, and muscles to keep them upright. They have to rely on their water content and their cell walls. So that's the difference between a sad, wilted plant and a happy, healthy plant, turgor pressure.
All living things are made up of cells. Cells of living things are modified for different functions, meaning their structure or shape has to do with what their job is inside the organism. So cells are the basic unit of structure, shape, and function, job, in living things. So if we take a look at the plant cells in this picture, for example, the neurons in this picture and the skin cells in this picture, they all have very different appearances because they all have very different jobs. So a plant cell, remember, plant cells have cell walls for structure because plants don't have skeletons or internal structure. They also have to hold a lot of water, and if they're part of a leaf, for example, they need to be flat and wide so that they can create more surface area for sun for photosynthesis. Neurons send signals throughout our bodies, so they benefit from having long branching wires so that they can closely communicate with cells around them. Skin cells over here are kind of flat and wide, and they're flexible and thin because their job is to be a protective layer around your outside between you and the world. So if you think about the different job of a skin cell versus a neuron versus a plant cell, their shape has to do with their job, and they don't all look exactly alike. Next, we have the discovery of the cell. So this guy, arrow right onto his face, that is Robert Hooke. So the year is 1663. Think the plague, Shakespeare, and pilgrims, all for similar things happening around the same time. Robert Hooke is an English scientist, and he decided to look at a thin piece of cork, which is made out of wood, the same wood that is used for cork in wine bottles. That's wood, typically. Sometimes it's rubber now. So he decided to take a look at a piece of cork under a microscope, and he saw all of these little boxes that you can see in this picture, and they reminded him of prison cells, so he called them cells. So that is when the cell was discovered and named. Then, fast forward 10 years later, we have this fun-looking guy. That's Anton van Leeuwenhoek, and he decided to look at lake water under a microscope and noticed some tiny single-celled organisms that he decided to call wee beasties. In fact, he called them cavorting wee beasties, which means little tiny organisms that are playing around. We call these single-celled organisms or microorganisms. In your slides, it's a GIF, so you can watch those little things swim around. But that is one of the earlier discoveries of microorganisms. Fast forward 100 years, We take the research from Robert Hooke, the discoverer of cells, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who noticed microorganisms, add in a couple other scientists, and over the course of 100 years with different people working on it, they come up with a theory called cell theory. This states that all living things are composed of cells, meaning if it's alive, it's made out of cells. All cells are produced from other cells, meaning a cell can't spontaneously just generate itself. It had to come from a parent organism, whether that's a whole human parent or a bacteria parent. For example, cells don't just come out of nowhere. They have to come from a living thing. And cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things, meaning it's the smallest part of an organism that can do a complete job. All three of those statements must be true for something to be considered a living organism. So if we think about a virus, that's always our go-to example for something that doesn't fit the mold. Since viruses don't have cells, they can't be considered alive because cell theory states that if you're going to be considered alive, you have to be made out of cells. Here are our basic types of cells. So we have prokaryotic, or these are also called prokaryotes, which I'm going to add to the slide off to the side here. Those are simple single-celled organisms. Primarily, the only thing we're going to talk about in the prokaryotic category this year is bacteria. And here's a nice labeled picture of bacteria. The other type of cell is called eukaryotic, or a eukaryote, and I will add that here as well. And I have your pronunciation guide right above and below. So prokaryote, as in you're a pro at carrying oatmeal, you bacteria. Eukaryote, you are a eukaryote. You carry the oatmeal so well. You're a eukaryote because you are a complex multicellular organism. We'll break down the differences between these in a moment. But if we're looking at this chart of living things, this side we have the prokaryotes. Again, the only thing we're really going to talk about in the prokaryote category this year is bacteria. And there are tons of different types of bacteria, but that is the category that's simple single-celled organisms. Everything else is either complex and single-celled or complex and multicellular. Those are all eukaryotes. And under this blanket category of eukaryotic organisms, we have plants, animals, fungi, one fungus, two fungi, and then that's a typo, that should say protist. A protist is something that's not quite plant, not quite animal. So we have fungus, we have protist. Those are our other categories. Let's see if I can draw these lines to extend. Okay, so if we're looking at this like a family tree, prokaryotes are one category, eukaryotes are the other category. Within eukaryotes are most of the things we think of as organisms, so plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Another way we can categorize living things is into heterotrophs and autotrophs. So we did this slide together in class, which is where these words came from. But the prefix hetero means mixed, and the word troph, root word troph, means energy. So heterotrophs need a mixed source of energy. These are organisms that need to go seek their nutrients from their environment. They have to eat food. So you are a heterotroph because you might be able to cook food in the kitchen or make yourself a bowl of cereal, but you cannot make your own food internally inside of your cells. Autotrophs, the prefix auto means self, troph means energy, can make their own food internally in a process called photosynthesis. So autotrophs, we're talking about plants. Pretty much only plants can be autotrophs. There are some other things like protists we mentioned that go into the autotroph category because they can photosynthesize, even though they might not be plants necessarily. But heterotrophs are fungus, have to eat things, so they are decomposers. They feed on like wood that is rotting in the forest, for example. You'll find mushrooms growing on that. Humans, of course, have to go eat food. Animals, all animals you can think of, go eat food. Autotrophs are trees, which grow fruits and vegetables, plants, anything in the plant category, algae, seaweed. Those are not necessarily plants, but they are photosynthesizing organisms. And the process that plants use, we just said, photosynthesis is the production of glucose, which is a type of sugar, from sunlight and other materials. Plants photosynthesize. Plants are autotrophs, and animals are heterotrophs. Protists, we just mentioned. There is a type of organism called a protist that can both feed from its environment, heterotroph, and produce its own food through photosynthesis, autotroph. So that's why they're not quite plants, they're not quite animals. They get their own category. Most protists are single-celled organisms. Some kinds of algae are protists. This is an example of a euglena. It's a single-celled organism. This is algae. You can see it's multicellular, but they kind of have plant-like qualities. They kind of have animal-like qualities, so they get to be their own category. So in our class, we're going to focus on eukaryotic cells. Remember, complex organisms that have internal structure. We'll talk about those structures soon. Plants and animal cells will be our focus. Animal cells don't all have the same function. We started this slideshow with an example of that. Most animal cells are specialized, meaning they have their own specific jobs. So here's a picture of a variety of specialized cells from the human body. They all start as something called a stem cell, and then they branch off and differentiate into their different shapes and jobs. So you can see that a muscle cell is kind of compact and stretchy. A fat cell is for storage. Bone cells have all these interlocking connector parts. Blood cells are small and flexible, so they can travel through your body. Nerve cells are long and have all these branches to communicate with neighbor cells. Epithelial cell is a fancy term for any types of cells that kind of sit in compact layers. So connective tissue, skin, stomach lining, all that good stuff. Immune cell, those are your white blood cells that fight off disease. They're kind of blobby. They have to go engulf and destroy pathogens. And then the two types of sex cells, sperm cells can swim, and egg cells are rich in nutrients for the developing zygote, which we'll learn about later this year. We answered this question in class, but if you want a refresher, explain why it is important for cells to be specialized. So we talked about how a specialist is really good at their one job, as opposed to being okay at a bunch of different jobs. It's important for cells to be very good at their one job, and their structure, meaning their shape, makes them good for that task. There are a ton of tasks that need to happen in the body, so it makes sense that we have all of these specialized cells that are very good at all of those things. So a bit of background on the plant cell. Plants and animal cells have different characteristics. Plant cells have a sturdy structure surrounding their membrane called a cell wall. Animal cells don't have that. They only have a cell membrane. Why do you think a plant cell might need a cell wall, but an animal cell does not? We answered this in class. Here's our answer. Animals have internal structures like bones, and plants do not. Plants need those cell walls for their structure. If you take a look here, we have some celery. Celery is rich in a molecule called cellulose, and cellulose is a large component of the cell wall. So when you bite into celery and it's crunchy, you're crunching through all those cell walls, that's cellulose. And cells have many different tiny pieces inside of them. We have organs that each have a certain function inside our body. Cells are too small to have whole organs inside them, so they have something called organelles, which basically means tiny organs. And here's the difference, again, between prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Only eukaryotic cells have organelles, meaning those complex internal structures. So only complex organisms are eukaryotes. Prokaryotes have less internal structure. Bacteria typically has a cell wall or a cell membrane, a little bit of DNA floating around inside, and that's about it. So when we're talking simple versus complex, we're talking about all these little parts inside the cell. Once again, you have this in your slides, but we compared and contrasted prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. So our prokaryotes are simple single-celled organisms like bacteria. They don't have internal structure, they don't have organelles, and they never have more than one cell. Our eukaryotes are things like plant cells, animal cells. If you want to add fungus and protists to this side, you can too. These are complex. They can be single-celled, but they're typically multicellular. They do have organelles, all those little parts inside that we're going to learn about. In the middle, they're both types of living things. They're both types of cells. They can be one cell, and they need nutrients because they're organisms. So now we are going to dive into all those little parts of the cell that do all the jobs. This is a link in your Google Slides, so if you want to go watch a video, it's a really fun, cringy song where they repeat cells, cells, they're made of organelles, which sounds silly, but it will help you remember what those little things inside the cell are called. And that video walks you through a song of all the different parts of the cell and their jobs. We're going to go into that as well here, not in song form. So the cell membrane is the outer boundary of the cell. Its job is to separate the contents of the cell from the environment around it, or from the cell next to it in a multicellular organism. It controls the transport of materials into and out of the cell, and it recognizes and responds to chemical changes. So we said that the cell membrane is kind of like the bodyguard of the cell. It lets certain things in if it's good for the cell. It doesn't let everything in. That's what it means to be semi-permeable. Also here, a note, this is a fancy microscope image of a cell. These are artists' renditions of a cell diagram. If you look at these organelles, we're going to focus on understanding what these distinctive shapes are and identifying organelles based on what they look like. But you'll see in a picture that's an actual photograph and a diagram, these organelles are going to look very different across different representations. So we're going to get used to recognizing them in all different formats. So the cell wall. Only plant cells have cell walls, which is why it's in parentheses there. Here is what it looks like in a lot of diagrams. It's kind of that rigid outer outline of the cell. And it's a rigid layer that surrounds plant cells. It helps protect and support the cell. It's mostly made out of cellulose. That's what we talked about with celery. And water, oxygen, other materials can pass through the cell wall pretty easily. Also, inside the cell wall, you can't really tell, but in this picture, there's a cell membrane around the inside layer. So plant cells have both a cell wall and a cell membrane. Here's a recap. Why do plant cells have cell walls and animal cells do not? Animals have bones for internal structure. Plants need the structure from the cell wall because plants need structure too. So a plant stem has a lot of cell walls that are strong and holding it up as opposed to a skeleton. Then we have the nucleus. So again, here is an artist's picture with one big nucleus at the center of this cell. Here is a photograph under a microscope. These are onion cells. These nuclei are purple because they've dyed this with a stain so that we can see them, because onions are typically clear under the microscope, so the stain can help us differentiate the parts. The nucleus is the largest organelle in most cells, and it's an oval that acts like the control center of the cell. So it directs all of the cell's activities. The way it does this is it contains all of the DNA, so the genetic information, inside the nucleus. Sometimes on diagrams, you'll see what looks kind of like an egg yolk inside an egg. That core of the nucleus is called the nucleolus. We're not going to get into the role of the nucleolus, but if you do see two separate circles at the center of the cell on a diagram, they're showing you nucleolus is inside the nucleus. But if you think about DNA for a moment, your DNA is kind of like the instruction manual for everything you do. So it's not just what you look like or how you act or whether or not you can taste garlic. It's more about, so all of the things your body is made out of and needs to replace and repair, all of the functions your body has, all of those are controlled by your DNA. They're the instructions to absolutely everything. And those are inside the nucleus. So that is why the nucleus is kind of like the boss or the brain of the cell, because it has all of those instructions and it has to tell all the other parts of the cell what to do. What analogy can you use to help you remember the role of the nucleus? Well, I just gave it away. We're usually going to call it the brain of the cell, the control center, or the boss. Cytoplasm. So this cytoplasm on your slide, this is a GIF that moves. These are both pictures of an amoeba. This one's a still image under a microscope. That one's moving. And an amoeba is a eukaryotic protist, meaning it is single cell, but it does have internal structure. It has organelles. But I used it on this slide because you can see in the amoeba that its cytoplasm is actually flowing and moving. That's how an amoeba moves around. So cytoplasm is the background goo of the cell, and it holds all the organelles in place. And it's kind of like Jell-O, but it fills up the region between the cell membrane and the center, the nucleus. And all of the organelles sit in the cytoplasm, and things can actually move through it. So the cytoplasm is a fluid that can flow, and it can move, and it can carry materials and information throughout the cell. In all of the pictures we're going to look at, like these pictures, for example, the background of the cell is the cytoplasm. Moving on to the mitochondria, the internet's favorite organelle. So here we have a microscopic image. This is an artist's version, but it's a rod-shaped, meaning like a pill or a tablet, structure floating in the cytoplasm, the background, that is referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria, that's plural. Mitochondrion is one. Mitochondria is plural. Mitochondria convert energy stored in food, so foods that we eat, to energy that our cells can use to live and function. And that energy is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. So if you see the letters ATP or the words adenosine triphosphate, that is fancy talk for energy, meaning all the energy you need to do all of your functions, from breathing and eating to sleeping, all the way up through climbing a mountain or swimming across a river. And that is pronounced, here's a little guide for you, adenosine triphosphate. So in ATP, the A is for adenosine, the T is for tri, and the P is for phosphate. And if you remember from the periodic table, phosphorus is an element, so that's what phosphate means. At this point, hopefully we'll start to understand some of those mitochondria memes on Instagram. Here's one of my personal favorites because it doesn't make sense until you know what the mitochondria is and does. Roses are red. It's hot like hell. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So if you didn't know what this was a picture of or what the mitochondria's job is, now you can get this meme. In this one, happy October. In October, the mitochondria turns into the phytochondria and becomes the haunted house of the cell. And down here, you're almost 22. You should have learned about taxes in high school. First of all, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, so I know it's weird that I'm joking about how you don't really need to know what the mitochondria is in real life after high school biology. However, for the purposes of our class, it is one of the most important parts of your body, and we're going to need to talk about it a lot. So we are going to get deeper into the details of what the mitochondria does and why we care so much about it, but without it, you wouldn't be alive, so it is pretty cool. Next, we have chloroplast, also only found in plant cells. So far, the only ones that have been in just plants are chloroplast and cell walls. Everything else is either in both, and we haven't done anything that's only in animal cells yet. So the chloroplast is the organelle that captures energy from the sun and turns it into a form of energy that cells can use in making food. And that food is called glucose, which is a type of plant sugar. Chloroplast contains a pigment called chlorophyll, and that's what makes it green. And to remember the difference between those, I like to think of chlorophyll's the chloroplast. Again, here is an artist's version, and here is a photo under the microscope. And we looked at Alodia leaf cells under the microscope. They had chloroplast in them. Looks very similar to this. Our next few organelles I put on the same slide so that we can see them because they interact for all of their jobs. So we have the endoplasmic reticulum, which we call the ER for short, and it comes in two versions. It comes in rough and it comes in smooth. The ER is a system of membranes found in the cytoplasm. They're connected tubes and they act like a highway for information and materials. And they typically sit, this is a picture of them, the nucleus would be here. So they surround the nucleus because they're going to send all of that information and material from the nucleus out to the rest of the cell. The prefix endo is Greek for within, like inside, and plasm refers to the body of the cell, like the cytoplasm. So endoplasmic reticulum is the reticulum, fancy word for system, that is found inside the cell or in the cytoplasm. Now, the smooth ER has nothing on its outside. That's why it's smooth. The rough ER has something called ribosomes attached to the outside. So if you look at these pictures down here, those are showing you rough endoplasmic reticulum with all those little dots on them. Here's a microscopic image. Here is an artist's rendition. But the ribosomes are small, dense structures that either float throughout the cell, just in the cytoplasm, or they are attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Once again, the smooth ER doesn't have ribosomes attached to it. And ribosomes are really important because they read the information from the DNA and they turn that information into proteins. So they're kind of like the protein factories. And I know it's important for us to eat our protein, but it's actually our ribosomes' job to create proteins, not that we're going to eat, because remember, we don't eat any of the materials we make inside our bodies. We're not plants, but most of our bodies are made out of proteins. So something has to create all of those proteins. That is the ribosome's job. So they can float freely throughout the cell or they can be part of the ER, but they take the instructions that the nucleus gives them and they turn those instructions into materials. Next, we have the Golgi apparatus or the Golgi body. It looks like this kind of splat thing in all of our diagrams. There it is down there. There it is right there. A set of flattened membrane-bound sacs and cell products enter one side of the Golgi body, which then modifies, sorts, and packages materials for distribution into these little bubble-looking things, which are called vesicles. So this is mostly to send materials out of one cell into the next cell, but it can also send materials around the same cell. Your job on this slide is to look at this picture and list all the organelles you recognize so far. So what is this one? What's that? What's that? We recognize that. We know what the background is. We know what the outside layer is called. Go ahead and make yourself a list right there. One last thing on the Golgi body. I like to think of the Golgi body as Amazon of the cell because it takes all the materials, sorts them out, and sends them where they need to go. That's its job for the cell. Next, we have vacuoles. So sometimes vacuoles are called vesicles in an animal cell. So in this picture, that's an animal cell. There's its vesicle. Down here, that is a vacuole. This is a plant cell, and you can see that it's larger in the plant.
All right, so that demo at the beginning, that was to explain the vacuole. So if you missed what turgor pressure was all about or why I was talking about that, go back to the beginning now, rewatch, and then come back to this part.
So if we're comparing and contrasting this vacuole versus a vesicle or that vacuole, so as we saw in the demo, not only is the plant's vacuole larger because it needs to store all that water for the plant, but it also contributes to turgor pressure, which helps the plant keep its structure. So both the cell wall and the vacuole work together to give plants structure. You already know animals have more internal structures like skeletons, so they don't need that vacuole to be as large and hold so much water. Lysosomes are our first organelle that are only found in animal cells. So lysosomes are also vesicles that contain specific enzymes that break down large molecules. Enzymes are helper molecules that speed up chemical reactions. These enzymes digest food particles to provide nutrients for the cell, but primarily lysosomes are in charge of recycling materials in the cell by digesting old, damaged, or unused organelles. So if you watch your GIF in yours, you see the lysosome comes along, it eats up that old organelle, digests it, and then spits out the materials it doesn't need. That's kind of what's happening here as well. And I like to think that lysosome sounds kind of like Lysol. Lysol is in charge of cleaning. It's a cleaning product. So the lysosome is like the Lysol of the cell. It cleans out the old stuff you no longer need. One more note for this slide. Damaged or unused organelles. The cool thing about all of our cells and cells in living organisms, even in the diagrams, they might just show you one of each thing. They actually have a lot of backup organelles. So if you take a look at any of the diagrams, you'll see there's almost always more than one mitochondria showing. So in this picture, here's one, there are a couple over there, because our cells need a lot of energy sources. So they have multiple of those organelles. They don't just have one. So if one's not working, they kind of have a backup plan. The lysosome will come along, digest the unused, extra, dead, whatever it might be, organelle, get rid of it, and recycle those materials or get rid of the waste. Our last organelle is called the centriole, and centrioles are only found in animal cells. They are a set of small cylindrical structures, meaning cylinder-shaped. They really kind of look like Twizzlers or uncooked pasta or sometimes churros, depending on what you think. And they help with cell division, called mitosis. So you are not all the same cells you were born as. You've grown, you repair things, you create new things all the time. Even after you're done growing, you're still making new skin cells or growing your fingernails and producing new blood cells, replacing things. So your body is constantly doing something called mitosis, which is making new copies of your cells. And centrioles are really important to mitosis because they help create structures that can pull the cell apart when it's ready to divide into two new cells. And yours, once again, has a GIF here. You can watch that cell going through mitosis. So it doubles its DNA, makes copies of all its chromosomes. They move around the cell, and the centrioles create all the little structures that can help those chromosomes move through the cell, and then the cell is ready to split itself in half, and then you have two new copies of whatever cell you created. The last couple of slides, you are labeling these cells. So I'm going to give you the answer key here. So if you haven't tried it yet, go ahead and do that. But outside, we have the cell wall. This large pool is called the vacuole. The rough ER has those ribosomes attached to it. These red things, these red things are supposed to be the mitochondria. The Golgi apparatus is kind of hard to tell apart from the ER, but it's this orange thing. The smooth ER is the yellow without the dots. Our cell membrane is just inside the cell wall. The nucleus is that blue thing. The ribosomes are either the dots located freely or the dots on the ER. And the chloroplast, last but not least, very important for our plant cell, is this green thing. Moving along to our animal cell over here. Challenge, this one is not labeled, so you're going to have to generate those terms. So I'll type them in, but try this before I do it. Both of these sticks pointing to the purple thing, remember we said inside the nucleus is called the nucleolus. This, if you said it was pointing to some DNA, you'd be correct about that. But the purple thing in general is the nucleus. The outside of this, it's an animal cell, so no cell wall, so it's got to be the cell membrane. This blue background is our cytoplasm, holding all the organelles in place. This red part with the dots attached is our endoplasmic reticulum with the ribosomes, so that's our rough ER. The smooth part there that doesn't have ribosomes attached is the smooth ER. These dots around the cell are supposed to be the ribosomes. This hot dog with ketchup on it, that's what I think it looks like, is the mitochondria. This wiggly looking thing with the vesicles coming off of it is our Golgi body or Golgi apparatus. I will accept either word. And lastly, hard to tell on this diagram, it's not super thorough. These little bubbles, I would accept the answer lysosome or vacuole. It's hard to tell what those are supposed to be. And on a test or a quiz or the Regents, for example, you would always either have multiple choice or process of elimination where you could truly determine what those things are supposed to be based on context clues. So we'll practice with that too. So if you said vacuole for those, that's fine. If you said those are lysosomes, that also is a valid answer. So that is the end of this series of lessons. Feel free to scroll back through to anything you might have missed and let me know if you have any questions.